So it's so terrific to see all of you joining us today. We haven't had our lunch and learn for about months and a half, so it's always great to see you in person this way. And it's pretty much would celebrate our 2 years of our trip to Cuba. And the memory is still fresh because of the COVID. This year and a half almost doesn't count. So I personally feel that we just were there. And it was like one long night, and here we go. We're still due to meet in person with the Cuban food, with sharing all our pictures and sharing all our memories. And today it's just a great opportunity to refresh our memories and to learn again, because you listen and you forget. And Elena will introduce our
We have a very special guest, and today we'll be learning from Miriam Levinson. And I want to thank Andy and Ann Carmen for spearheading this program today and for helping us organize it. I know you know Miriam personally, and we're looking forward to learning from Miriam. And we also have a special guest who is visiting us from Cuba. He's actually in Miami. So a word or two about Miriam. Miriam Levinson is, she's heading the Chicago Jewish Community Center Travel Department. And she also taught as a Rhodes Scholar on Jewish Latin America. She has a very wonderful travel agency that she leads, and she organizes tours for Jewish groups all over the world, especially in Latin America and Morocco and Cuba, of course. And she's currently working on a book of her recollections of Cuba as a child when she lived there. And I believe we also will be joined by David Prinstein, who is a vice president of Beth Shalom, commonly known as El Patronato in Cuba. And David is going to join us as well from Miami, where he is visiting right now. And Miriam graciously agreed to translate David's presentation with us, because we speak other languages, but definitely not Spanish. So Spanish is not on our list. So thank you so much. Without further ado, Miriam, we're thrilled to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. Take us back to Cuba.
All right, so thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. And first, maybe I'll start telling you a little bit about my family, how my family arrived in Cuba, and then I'm going to take you back so that you will know how the Jews arrived in Cuba. Because Cuba has a very rich history of Jewish life. So the Odyssey actually started for my family in 1927. I don't know how many of you know that in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act was effected in the United States, which severely limited the amount of immigrants, especially from Eastern Europe, to the United States. And people like my grandfather, who lived in a little town called Nachals, he could not make a living there. He wanted to go to America because in America, as you know, money rains from the trees. So in 1927, when my grandfather figured that he couldn't make it to the USA, he found Cuba on a map. He figured, how far could it be from Cuba to the United States? After all, it's only 90 miles. Well, it turned out he lived in Cuba for 22 years before he finally got that visa that allowed him to go to the United States. So my grandfather went by himself. He was a very Orthodox person, and he left behind my grandmother and his 3 daughters. And he said, you know what, I will send for you. But that took a very long time. And meanwhile, my grandmother passes away in Poland, and he leaves the 3 little girls alone. I don't know who's moving my slides to the next one. So my grandfather arrives in Cuba. He was a tailor. He really didn't have a trade. And finally, after 6 years, he brings his daughters, my mother and her 2 sisters, to Cuba because their mother had already passed away. And for the last 3 years before they arrived in Cuba, these 3 little girls, they were just turning into their teen years, lived homeless because nobody wanted to take care of them in Poland. So they moved into old Havana, which some of you may have been there, and they live a very no-frills religious life in Cuba. And we're going to the next slide. My mother immediately called Cuba paradise. And here's a photo of my grandmother. My mother is to the left, my Aunt Frida's to the right, and Hannah arrived in Cuba when she was about 9 years of age. So I want to tell you the other side, which is in 1927 as well. My father, David, was about to be drafted into the Polish army. My dad was very short, very slight of build, and he had terrible eyesight. He really couldn't see very much. So his mother said to him, "I love you dearly, but I think you need to leave Poland." And she didn't think that he could survive in the Polish army. So a neighbor of theirs in Poland, and my father was from a town called Borsztów, which today is part of the Ukraine. My father knew a neighbor, and because of her, he immigrates to Cuba. This is a photo of my father with his Polish passport on his life's journey to go to Cuba. So from the time my father arrived in Cuba in the late 1920s, he embraced Cuba with passion and honor. And he always used to say, "I was born in Poland, but Cuba is my homeland." And for nearly 30 years after they arrived in Cuba, my parents' home was Cuba. They never had to worry about anti-Semitism. And they learned one thing from the Cubans, which is still true today, that you can be from different lands, you can speak a different language, you have different customs, but yet you're still accepted as one of their own. They just say, "You're just a little bit different, but you are part of us." So my father, unfortunately, never saw his mother or a sister again. They remained in Poland, and they were part of the victims of the Holocaust. Now, my father had a sister and a brother who had immigrated to the United States around 1920s. And they want to sponsor my father. After he arrived in Cuba, they said, "David, we want you to come to the States. We can bring you to the States." And my father said, "No, Cuba's my home." So my father's fate was sealed. He remained in Cuba. So my father was a watchmaker in Cuba, and he moved to an area, it's a suburb of Havana called Lujano, because he wanted to be close to that landsman from Poland who invited him to go to Cuba. And he opened up a small jewelry store and watch repair shop in Lujano. Now, Cubans have a way of calling people by different names. And because so many of Eastern European Jews spoke Polish, and they all said they came from Poland, the Cubans gave them a name, "You're a Polaco." We couldn't use those names here in the United States, but in Cuba, people are called more or less from the area they come from. So in our neighborhood, we were the Polish people, the Polacos. And this is a photo of my father's first store in the 1930s. Actually, it's like 4 steps from the home I grew up in. And this was his first store around 1931, 1932. So in Cuba, my mother, because her name was Cruza, I've never heard that name before, so she was given the name of Rosita. And she lived with that name for her whole life. In fact, the first time I ever learned that my mother's name was not Rosita was when we went to the American Embassy to apply for a visa to the United States. And that's when I learned my mother's real name was Cruza. So my mother and father meet in 1939, and they marry in 1940. And they remained in Lujano, which is a suburb of Havana. And for those of you that have been in Cuba, Louisiana is about 15 minutes from where Ernest Hemingway used to live, which is to some people, oh, it's so far away, but it's not. It's still within the environs of Havana City. This is my parents' engagement photo, and I'm very proud to say that that photo still hangs in my home, in the home that I was born. The people who live there now always say that that's David's house. And when I went back to Cuba in 2001 and I walked into the dining room and that photo was still there, and it's still there today. This is a photo of my mother in 1940 on her wedding day. So I want to tell you, there were 3 waves of Jews that came to Cuba in the 20th century. The first one was the American Jews, and the American Jews came to Cuba at the turn of the 20th century when Cuba became a republic. And that first wave of Jews that came were called by the Cubans Americanos because they came from the United States. These were mainly um, Reformed Jews that came to Cuba to try and find their fortune in Cuba. And they anchored there in Cuba, but they were never really part of a community. They were always a little bit different. And the Cubans called them Americanos. They formed the first synagogue in Havana. And that synagogue was located in Vedado. I'm sure if you've been to Cuba, you've passed it many times. It's a beautiful home, but it's no longer a synagogue. And then the second group of Jews that came to Cuba were the Sephardics. During the time of the Ottoman Revolution, some Sephardics moved to first, interesting enough, to New York. And in New York, they felt, they don't speak Spanish, they don't know our customs, they're not friendly enough. So many Sephardics, especially from the Turkish origin, moved to Cuba. And they anchored in Havana. They formed the first Sephardic synagogue of Cuba in Old Town. The third wave of Jews that came to Cuba were the Eastern European Jews, like my grandfather. Many of them were Orthodox. Many of them also came from the countries of Lithuania, Romania, Poland, Russia. And it was very interesting because when the Cuban Communist Party was founded in 1925, at the first meeting of the Communist Party in Cuba, there were about 13 or 14 Cuban Jews whose roots were from Russia, and they only spoke Yiddish. So they had to bring a translator to that first meeting of the Communist Party in Cuba. So there were 3 very distinct and different groups of Jews in Cuba. The Americanos, who became very wealthy, they were aloof, but they didn't mingle with the Sephardic or Ashkenazi. The Sephardics, who were not welcomed by the Americans or the Ashkenazi. The Ashkenazi were not welcomed by the Sephardic or Americanos. And at that time, prior to 1959, a marriage between a Sephardic and an Ashkenazi was truly considered an intermarriage in Cuba. It's not so anymore, but it used to be like that. So, what did they do as far as trades? Well, the Sephardic and Ashkenazim were basically shopkeepers because the people who came from Europe, most of them did not have college degrees. They were tradespeople. And now the Americans who lived in Cuba, they worked for American firms, and many of them opened up small factories or ran some of the very prestigious stores in Cuba. Jews, as a rule, did not engage in politics. They did not engage in banking, and many became very wealthy. Now, it's interesting, in Old Havana, there is a street that used to be called Muralla. It's no longer called that. But there were so many stores that were owned by primarily Eastern European Jews that the Cubans gave it a name. And the name they gave it wasn't Muralla Street. They said, oh, that's Calle de los Polacos. That is the street of the Polacks. And even today, older people, some still, if you ask them about Muralla Street, they'll say, oh, you mean the street of the Polacks, not meaning it in any slur at all. It's just to say there were a lot of Polish people who lived there. So my neighborhood, I want to tell you a little bit about my neighborhood. I lived in a totally Cuban neighborhood, except for 8 Jewish families who lived in the area at that time was called Luyano. And the reason we lived there was our parents had businesses, and we had the businesses on the main street. That street was at one time a way to take an alternative route to the interior of the country. So it was a very, very busy street. In fact, when you go to Hemingway's house, you always pass my street because it's the way to go into the interior. Most of the women did not work, Jewish women, but they tended to household chores, and most of the families had household help, but the women did the cooking. And we as Jewish children, we attended the Jewish day schools in Havana. And when our parents thought that the Jewish schools were not good enough for us, some of us would be sent to other elite schools in the city. So this is a picture. I'm included in there. I won't tell you where I am. This is going to a radio hour, the Jewish radio hour in Havana. And the school that I went to, which was to the left, if you take all the Jewish schools in the city, at that time we had 5 Jewish day schools in Havana. The Colegio Israelita de Cuba, we had to wear uniforms. So the girls would wear a blue uniform, and the insignia of the school was a Star of David. And in the middle, it would have the initials of the school. The school catered for children from kindergarten all the way to the 6th grade. I love that school. That's where I learned to read and write and speak Yiddish, because when I went to that school, Hebrew was not taught. We were taught Yiddish. And that's me writing the back of a photo that I sent to my grandfather in New York. And I'm just saying that I'm sending them a little souvenir of a photo for them. So today, unfortunately, I don't speak it very well, but if you give me a few minutes, I can still read it very well. And we celebrated many holidays. This is the photo that was that I wrote in back of. This is a Purim celebration because we celebrated all the holidays. And on that day, I wanted to be a little Dutch girl. So if you asked me what kosher meant in Cuba, I would have just drawn a blank. What's kosher? Because to me, to be Jewish was to learn songs about being Yiddish, dance the Hora, talk about our history. We would eat Jewish food at home, associate with Jewish people. And it was an honor to be able to read, write, and speak Yiddish. I was a member of Hashomer Hatzair, and we would always celebrate Jewish history, holidays and history. And perhaps we had a dream we would be a halutzim and go live in a kibbutz in Israel. Of course, this was when I was very young. It was very special to be Jewish. And it was interesting when I immigrated to the United States and my mother took me to a religious day school in New York. The headmistress of the school said, "Your children are not Jewish. They don't even know what kosher is." We didn't. So how did we live as Jews in Cuba, especially in my neighborhood, because we didn't have a lot of Jewish people in my neighborhood. So my mom would do candle lighting every Friday, and she would do typical Jewish cooking for all the holidays. And I knew Pesach was coming because the whole house had to be cleaned out. And we would go for holidays, services, we would do all the holidays. And my parents spoke Yiddish between themselves, but they spoke Spanish to my sister and I. And when they learned that my sister and I understood Yiddish, then they switched to Polish. So it was very interesting pretending we didn't understand what my parents were telling to each other. And as a child, I always knew when a Jewish holiday was coming, because my mother would always take us to buy new clothes and shoes, and for no special reason, but especially when food from the grocery store, the Jewish grocery store, was delivered to our home, because we lived about a half hour away from the downtown area of Havana. So our lives mirrored most Cuban families, except for religion. And the neighbors knew that we could not eat pork products or seafood. I mean, my parents would say to the neighbors, you can feed them anything you want if they come to your house, but you cannot eat pork or seafood. And we were just like any other family in the neighborhood. I would wear an amulet. It's called an asabache. It's black and orange coral to ward off the evil eye. And if we had a fever or we didn't feel good, our moms would always put a little red thread by our forehead. That was part of making us feel well. For Yom Kippur, my mom would pass a live chicken over our heads for Gappuras. And it's similar to what Santeros, because in Cuba, the main religion is still Santeria, and the Santeros do the same thing. So it's interesting that some of the things they follow in Cuban Santeria are some of the things that we follow, or some people follow in Orthodoxy. This is just a picture of our family. I was about 10 years old at the time, and we were getting ready to go to a wedding. People would dress very fancy, and we would wear the best that we had whenever we would go to fancy weddings. And the weddings in Cuba at that time were very, very fancy. And this is a picture of in our home. My mother, my aunt, and my mother's younger sibling for a birthday party that we had. I think you can tell from the picture that, again, people were dressing up quite well, quite fancy. At that time, many Jewish families lived very well. In fact, my cake, there's a cake there. My mother made sure that the person making the cake would have a little doll on top to mirror what I was wearing that day. And there's just another birthday party that was being done, very similar to parties all over the world. And more pictures. So we lived very, very nice lives, and then it stopped just when the revolution was taking effect. I want to take you back just for a few minutes to tell you how the Jews arrived in Cuba. And for some of you that may not know this, you know, the first Jews that came to Cuba came with Columbus. When Columbus left to find the riches of the New World, he found instead Cuba. And his navigator and many of the people in his caravel, you know, his boat, were of the Jewish faith. So the first person to spot land was Luis de Torre. who himself was a converso, and he spotted Cuba, and he was the first European man to set foot in Cuba. So because Cuba then became a colony or a possession of Spain, Jews could not live in Cuba. In fact, Spain ruled Cuba for about 400 years, and during that time, you could not be a Jew and live in Cuba. That changed for a brief period in 1760 when the British possessed Cuba for a few months. And so some Jews moved to Cuba at that time, but as soon as Spain took it over again, you couldn't say you were a Jew and live in Cuba. That changed after the Spanish-American War. So after the Spanish-American War, and it was the Cuban-Spanish War, but it's always called the Spanish-American War, then sailors that were from the United States of the Jewish faith started to think, well, perhaps once this war is over, we could go to Cuba and have a business there. And effectively, when Cuba became a republic in 1902, Jews from the United States moved to Cuba to start their dream of opening up businesses in Cuba. One of the very interesting things that many people don't know is our national hero, Jose Marti. Jose Marti lived in New York most of his adult life. And he had an exile there, and he wanted a free Cuba. And many of his friends were Jewish. In fact, two of the most well-known friends that Marti had were Mr. Steinberg and Mr. Schechter, who used to live in Ybor City. And Marti would go to their store, and Marti would say to them, when Cuba is free, I want you to move to Cuba. I want you to live there with your families. So Steinberg and Schechter helped the Cuban Revolution, so much so that they have been honored by the Cuban government at the time for their help to the Cuban Revolution. Steinberg and Schechter did move to Cuba. In fact, they were the nucleus of the small American population that lived in Cuba at the turn of the 20th century. And if you've been to the cemetery in Havana, you will see that they have very prominent graves in the Jewish cemetery in Guanabacoa. When Mr. Steinberg died, the Cubans were they just wanted to honor him. So a platoon of soldiers went walking from Havana all the way to the Jewish cemetery in Guanabacoa, which probably took them 4 or 5 hours, if not more, just to honor them. So the Steinberg and Schechter families lived in Cuba up until the turn of the revolution, and then they left. I would say I never encountered any anti-Semitism when I lived in Cuba at all. And even today, there is no anti-Semitism. When they call us Polacos or Americanos, and by the way, they used to call the Sephardic Turcos, it was not because of anti-Semitism. It was just the way the Cubans are. I mean, if you came from the country, they would say, oh, that's a Guajiro, meaning, oh, he's from the country. But it was never an anti-Semitic type of thing. I'm honored that they still call me La Polaquita in the neighborhood where I grew up. So we lived very nice lives prior to the Cuban Revolution of 1959. And then Fidel Castro took over. At first, he was very welcomed by all the Cubans. But when he started to nationalize the businesses, and the rumor was about the homes, and when he started to cut the rents, 90% of Cuban Jews left Cuba. They went to the United States mainly. Some went to Puerto Rico, Venezuela, Israel. And the Cuban Jews as we know it today, it's not the same way it used to be. For so many years after the triumph of the revolution, we really had no idea what was going on with the Jewish community. I think people were afraid to practice religion, even though Fidel Castro was never anti-Semitic. And from what I understand, the school that I went to, which was Colegio Israelita de Cuba, he kept that school open until the last child left the school. He never had any ill feelings towards Jewish people, but religion was something that you just didn't practice for many years after the triumph of the revolution. In fact, Fidel has been to the Patronato, I think once, if not twice, and his brother Raul also went to commemorate Hanukkah not too long ago at the Patronato. So being Jewish in Cuba, you're just like everybody else. There's nothing different. Religion actually started again, in my opinion, from what I've read, after the Pope came to Cuba in 1992. And he said to Fidel, why don't we practice Christmas? And Fidel said, okay, so from now on, we'll have Christmas. And I think at that time, people just needed a little bit of faith. And also with the help of Dr. Miller, who was the president of the Patronato for many, many years. And he reached out to Jewish organizations, primarily in the United States and Canada. People started coming back to the faith, and they started to look for the Jews. In fact, there are many people today, I imagine, in Cuba that may have Jewish blood and don't even know they're Jewish, because faith was just something they didn't practice for a while. Thanks to the efforts of David Princeton, I hope he's still with us right now in the program, and Adela Duran, the president of the Synagogue, the Patronato has become an incredible place for Jews to come and learn about each other. And it's wonderful to go to Cuba and go to the Patronato, especially on Friday night services, and have a service just like you would in any other synagogue in the world. And then also there is the Sunday school that they have for children. So even when they're little kids, even from their 2 and 3 years of age, they start learning what it is to be a Jew. We're still Cubans, but we're Jewish. And with COVID, it has been a very, very difficult because people started going to Cuba. I mean, you couldn't even go even if you wanted to. And the Patronato has been helped all these years by people like yourselves who bring in donations and monetary gifts. And this is what keeps the synagogues open in Cuba, because they don't get any government assistance. They're open. There are 3 synagogues in Havana that are open. We have the Patronato, we have the Sephardic synagogue, and then we have the Orthodox synagogue. And there are other Jewish houses of learning throughout the island, but the 3 main ones are in Havana. And for 2 years now, no one has come. And it's become very, very difficult. So this is where I'm going to turn it over to questions for me or for David.
Miriam, David is there with you, just so you know. I've
Yes, I
spotlighted
see
him with
him.
you. Okay, terrific.
Thank you, Miriam, for this wonderful, wonderful presentation. You're a wonderful, terrific storyteller. And for all of us who visited Cuba 2 years ago, it was a great refresher.
Actually, it's more than a refresher. We actually saw it from a different side. Yeah. Thank you, Miriam, because we had amazing guides. It was really educating, but we've seen Jewish community as it is now. And to summarize what it is now, it's a Zochenweh, right? It's like really
Yeah.
not in a great shape. And to see how beautiful and how powerful it was in the days of your childhood, it actually was totally new take for at least for us here. So thank you to explaining and showing us of what actually the real Jewish Cuban community was.
So we wanted, David, welcome to our Lunch and Learn. We wanted to ask you a couple of questions about your community nowadays. We visited right before COVID. It was exactly 2 years ago. And we want to know how you navigated through this difficult 2 years for everybody around the world. We've been talking about Cuban community many times with the people we visited in 2020, because it was hard for everybody. It was hard for us here in US. It was hard for anyone anywhere in the world, but we were just sharing our sentiment about how difficult it probably was, much more difficult it was for you guys there in Cuba. So can you tell us a little bit how you navigated through this difficult 2 years? And
I'm going to have to translate. David, ¿me oyes? ¿Me
I'll try
oyes?
to ask shorter questions, Miriam.
No, that's okay.
Make sure.
David,
Sí.
¿me oyes?
Sí, perfectamente.
Sí. So, ella quiere saber cómo has podido navegar en estos 2 años de COVID, cómo te has podido mantener la comunidad.
Bueno, primero que todo, quiero agradecer la oportunidad que hemos tenido de estar aquí junto con ustedes y poder un poco expresar el trabajo que hemos hecho en estos 2 años en tiempos de pandemia. Creo que has abordado una gran parte de la historia, Miriam. Tú eres como una fiel, digamos, viviente del desarrollo que tiene la comunidad hebrea de Cuba. En algún momento les pondré, si nos da el tiempo, un pequeño video que nosotros tenemos para poder mostrar a todas las personas qué ha sido de la comunidad hebrea de Cuba en estos 30 y tantos años y cuál es el trabajo que hemos hecho ahora en estos 2 años para mantener viva la identidad judía en la isla. Pero me hace falta que me den un instante en lo que tú le vas traduciendo a ellos para yo compartir en mi pantalla este pequeño fotografías y parte de la presentación que yo tenía preparada.
So he's going to show some slides and I'm going to translate. And for the past 33 years, this is when, let's say, the new Jewish community has arisen. So what he's going to tell you is how they have been able to survive. Okay. So did you have to make him a co-host?
Yeah, David is a co-host, so he should be able to screen share.
Okay, ya puedes poner las fotos en la... So while he's getting that ready, can you hear me? So while he's getting that, David, ¿vas a decir algo? So you will see the pictures of here of the Patronato. On the top left corner is the outside of the Patronato. The middle, ¿ya estás ahí?
Ya está.
Okay, so he's ready.
Bueno, discúlpeme, es que realmente esta modernidad de Zoom para mí es novedosa. No estamos acostumbrados en Cuba por la lentitud de la internet usar estos medios. Entonces, les pido que me disculpen en este momento, pero ya estamos listos ya.
Okay, empieza. So he said, excuse me, because in Cuba we're not used to Zoom.
Bueno, creo que como bien tú habías abordado, Cuba tuvo una comunidad en su gran momento con casi 25,000 personas y después que triunfa la revolución en el año 1959, pues la mayoría de los judíos emigran. Como tú bien dijiste, no solo, o sea, nunca fue por cuestiones de antisemitismo, todas las familias emigraron, evidentemente por cuestiones económicas. Cuba, cuando triunfa la revolución, entre todas las medidas que toman, fueron la nacionalización de diferentes, o sea, de todas las empresas, los negocios privados, y las familias decidieron emigrar a distintas partes del mundo, elementalmente en los Estados Unidos.
Okay, tienes que parar. So he said he's just reaffirming that the reason the Cuban Jews left, and by the way, there was about 25,000 Jews in Cuba prior to the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. And they didn't leave for anti-Semitism, they left for financial issues.
Ya en los años 90, después en los años 90, como también tú comentaste, pues comienza un proceso de reorganización comunitaria con la ayuda del American Joint Jewish Distribution Committee y las diferentes federaciones judías en los Estados Unidos.
So after, in the 1990s, with the help of the American Jewish Congress and the Joint, there is a reawakening of Jewish life in Cuba.
Y empezamos a organizar diferentes, en los años 90, cuando aún éramos un poco más jóvenes que ahora, comenzamos a organizar varios programas y proyectos que iban a ir enriqueciendo la vida de los judíos en la isla.
So in the 1990s, they started to develop programs to help the Jews of the island.
Programas como el programa educativo, nuestra escuela dominical Mahon Albert Einstein, en honor a la última escuela judía que existió en La Habana.
So the school, the Jewish school was named Einstein because that was the name of the last Jewish school that was in Cuba prior to the triumph of the revolution.
Nuestra escuela dominical hasta hoy día acoge a un % muy significativo de los judíos en La Habana, casi 150, 160 personas de toda La Habana, tanto niños de 4 y 5 años que aprenden todas sus tradiciones, hasta adultos mayores con deseo de seguir aprendiendo judaísmo.
So the school boasts between 150 to 160 participants, from small kids to adults, to learn about being Jewish.
La escuela también está encargada de formar y preparar los Benei Mitzvah, o sea, tiene cursos personalizados de Bar y Bar Mitzvah para que los jóvenes puedan en su edad hacer la celebración correspondiente.
So the school also takes care of the young people so that they're able to do their B'nai, their Bat and Bat Mitzvah and B'nai Mitzvahs, and the school gets them ready for that.
También tenemos programas de atención social, donde jóvenes se integran en un programa de atención a los adultos que tienen dificultades como enfermedades, discapacidades, etcétera, y se atienden directamente en sus casas.
So the school also takes charge of helping people that have various disabilities, and those people are being helped at their own homes.
Tenemos un programa de danza folclórica israelí de Rikudim, que es por excelencia el programa que engalana todas las festividades y todas las conmemoraciones de nuestra comunidad.
So they also have a program of Israeli folk dancing, and they usually perform during many of the holidays.
Tenemos un programa médico farmacéutico, una farmacia comunitaria con médicos profesionales dentro de la comunidad que entregan a cada familia, tanto judía como no judía, medicamentos que llegan donados por cada una de las personas que han ido visitando la comunidad en el transcurso de estos años.
So we also have a pharmacy, and the pharmacy helps not only Jewish families, but non-Jewish families. And we get the goods from people like yourself when you bring it to Cuba, and then we distribute it to the people that may need it. And that's the pharmacy of the Patronato.
También tenemos programas de la juventud como elemento más importante en la vida comunitaria. Están integrados a todas las cuestiones que tienen que ver con la vida tradicional, siendo partícipe de todo el desarrollo comunitario.
So we also have a program especially for the youth, to teach them and train them about the Jewish life. And
Y
that's part of our community.
Y tenemos también una importante organización femenina. La mujer judía cubana juega un rol primario en nuestra vida de la comunidad. Casi el 70% del liderazgo de la comunidad está en manos de las mujeres y están constantemente trabajando en las labores más importantes de toda la vida comunitaria.
So we also have the women's club or league, as you would say, and 70% of the membership is women. And so they watch how to keep Jewish customs and traditions.
¿Qué pasó una vez que comenzamos el COVID-19 en Cuba?
So what happened after COVID started in Cuba?
Paralizamos toda la vida comunitaria para conservar la vida de cada una de las personas.
So we had to stop everything we used to do so we could stay alive.
Dividimos el trabajo con grupos reducidos de voluntarios en dos bloques importantes.
So we divided what we do into two separate parts, and it was reduced people that were able to help.
Hasta ese momento, la vida judía se llevaba en comunidad.
So up until
Todo transcurría dentro de la comunidad, Shabbat, festividades, el desarrollo de cada uno de los programas y los proyectos, todo se desarrollaba dentro de la comunidad.
so everything was being developed within the community.
Y a partir de la pandemia, pues empezamos a trasladar la vida comunitaria a cada una de las casas.
But when COVID started, we had to stop our communal life or the way that we used to be, and everybody had to stay home.
Como no teníamos posibilidad de hacer Zoom por la calidad del internet en la isla, pues a través de las redes sociales, WhatsApp, comenzamos a hacer Shabbat, festividades y talleres, y de esa manera hemos logrado mantener la vida tradicional.
Because in Cuba, we don't have Zoom and we don't have some of the things that we're so used to here in the States. We resorted to WhatsApp, and through WhatsApp, we were able to hold services, and people were able to join using the WhatsApp program.
Y la otra cuestión importante fue que nos dedicamos a conseguir y a comprar alimentos para todos los meses y llevar un módulo de alimentos a cada una de las familias a sus casas. Leche, carne, pollo, pescado, vegetales, en fin, llevábamos un módulo de alimentos todos los meses para que las personas no tuvieran que salir a la calle y se mantuvieran en sus casas.
So what we were able to do is to bring necessities to everybody's home, whether it be chicken or milk or fish or whatever people needed as basic necessities. And in this manner, people did not have to leave their homes. Everything was brought to the people's homes.
O sea, de alguna manera, todos los donativos que hemos ido recibiendo en estos últimos años fueron usados en la compra de alimentación para apoyar a toda la población judía.
So whatever donations we received, we were able to use the monetary donations to help the Jewish community survive during the COVID time. Everything was used to buy goods for the people of the community.
Cuba está en una crisis, no solo ahora en estos 2 años de pandemia. Cuba viene arrastrando una crisis de hace muchos años.
So Cuba has been on a very high crisis, not only the past 2 years, but Cuba has been in a crisis for many, many years before that.
Y la falta de visitas de judíos a la isla y la falta del apoyo que siempre tuvimos, no solo está presente en estos 2 años de pandemia, está presente en 2 años de pandemia y en 4 años del gobierno de la administración anterior, donde dejaron de visitar a la isla por todas las vías los judíos que normalmente nos apoyaban y nos ayudaban con medicamentos, con efectivo y con muchos de los donativos que siempre facilitaban la vida de cada uno de nosotros en la isla.
So it's not only the past 2 years, but it's also the 2 years before that during the former American administration, because we used to get so many donations from different groups and different people that used to help us so we could keep going. So it's been a very difficult struggle for the past few years, not just during COVID.
Hoy día la comunidad se encuentra en una situación bien crítica, dada la que se fue agotando cada uno de los recursos que teníamos para seguir apoyando a la población.
So the community right now is in a very difficult period. It's in a critical period because we have used up most of the resources that we had from before.
Y yo he estado aprovechando mi estancia en los Estados Unidos para poder ir recaudando fondos para poder seguir ayudando a la comunidad.
And I am using the time that I'm here in the United States to collect funds to help the community.
Hoy día hemos logrado enviar fondos a Cuba por más de $5,000 y tenemos más de 250 kilogramos de leche y más de 200 libras de medicamentos para poder enviar.
So we have I've been able to collect about $5,000, and we've been able to collect 250 kilos of milk, which is sorely needed for the people. ¿Y qué más de leche, David? No recuerdo.
Tenemos 255 kilogramos de leche, tenemos medicamentos, tenemos aseo y tenemos comida.
And so we've also been able to collect medications and items for toiletries for the people to send to Cuba.
Y una de las cosas que estamos haciendo ahora es tratando de recaudar fondos para poder enviar lo que ya tenemos en este momento a la isla.
So what we're trying to do now is to collect some money so that we can ship the goods that we have been able to receive, you know, the goods of that
Miriam,
yeah.
I want to interrupt you for just a second because I want us on the screen, if David will take off the screen share from his computer.
Yes.
To share the list that you provided for
Okay.
us, the medication list that we want to share with those who are in attendance, that you can bring to the temple. We will, of course, connect after this lunch and learn after the Zoom and figure out how and where we can send this medication.
Okay.
And of course, we will make a significant donation to Sergey sharing a picture of us
Where we,
when
David?
we were,
that's all, yeah, that's all we brought back then.
yeah,
Ese
3
es
years
el-
ago.
David, te quitaron eso porque quieren enseñar la lista para poder mandar a ustedes. Este es el grupo de ellos con lo que trajeron para Cuba.
Bueno, muy
Yeah.
bueno. Sobre todo, sillas de ruedas son una de las necesidades grandes que tenemos ahora en este momento.
So one of the things they really need are wheelchairs. I know I've brought some wheelchairs when I have been to Cuba. So wheelchairs is something. So this is a list of stuff that, listen, anything that you can get over the counter, if you go into a CVS or a Walgreens or whatever pharmacy you can go to, they need everything. I mean, anything that you can get, you can.
So Miriam, we just want to clarify, when we make donations of medication or over-the-counter or hygiene products, we collect them and then
And checks.
and checks and money. Where do we send it?
So are you going to so David should be sent the donations, or are you going to keep them at the synagogue and then send them to David?
I think we're going to have both. I think we're going to have some goods that we want to ship to David so he can take it, or from Miami ship it directly to Havana. And there
Right.
will be some funds that we will transfer to him.
There was a lot of desire, even over the last 2 years, to do something because
And
we've
help.
seen the poverty, and we wanted to do. And Andy and Carmen's chair our Cuban committee of our world connections, because we're trying to help not only Cuban committee, not only Cuban society, but always the question: how do we connect? How do we send? And how to implement all of this?
All right, so David's address to send it is 12549.
Can you please put it in the chat?
In the chat, yes, for all of us, and we will save it.
For me to do it now?
Yeah, if you
Yeah.
don't mind, yeah.
Yeah, hold on. I mean, I think my suggestion is monetary funds that you want to do is maybe bring them to you. And then when you have them all ready, I will give you David's information, or you can send them to me and I'll send it to David. And
Excellent.
believe me, 100%, there's no fee here or anything, everything will go. It costs about $2 a pound just to send things to Cuba. So just bringing them to Miami would be nice, but we still have to ship it to Cuba. And they need to buy goods. So any donations would be greatly appreciated. For some reason, I can't send the
All right,
check.
so you know what we can do? We can connect after this lunch and
Yeah,
learn.
we'll send
and
to
we will
everyone.
send
We
it to
actually will send
everyone.
not only to this group, we will send it to the entire congregation.
Right. I mean,
Folks, we're getting a question in the chat. Sorry to interrupt. I may be from Donna. I may be able to get a wheelchair, walker, and commodes. How would I do this? Can someone pick them up from the temple?
So do you know what? Let's stop sharing the screen for now because we will send this list anyway. Yep. So we'll now we can see the questions. Yeah.
okay. So, you know, we'll send to everybody on the program. I'll send you David's address. David, voy a mandar tu dirección a la gente. Okay.
Ok.
And
De todas maneras, le pregunta si hay posibilidad de poder compartir el video que tenía presentado para que ellos vieran la composición de la vida comunitaria, Miriam.
okay, so he wants to know whether before we end, if he could show the video that he has before we end the program.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
definitely,
of
definitely.
course.
But we definitely need your guidance because we have a lot of
Desire to
help and
Right.
very little knowledge of how.
Yeah,
So I think that a donation would be incredible, whether it's monetary or with goods. And I will send you David's address so you can send the goods to him. And then for the monetary, you can send them to me and I'll put it all together in a check. I'll write whatever it is, send it to David, and he can use that to send the goods to Cuba and whatever is left over to Cuba for things they need. I mean, I have been in Cuba many times when people tell me, my God, I can't even get an aspirin, so I have to go to the synagogue to get an aspirin.
right.
It's an incredible thing that what the synagogue does, because people know, not just the Jewish people, but the people in the neighborhood know that if they need something, that if the synagogue has it, they will give you the medication. And I have been there at times too, believe it or not, when a hospital will call the patronato and say, do you have this? Because we don't have it at the hospital and we need it for somebody. And the synagogue, of course, gives it to whoever needs it. So in that regard, we're brothers and sisters.
What is the deadline?
I'm sorry?
What is deadline? When David goes back?
David, ¿cuándo se tiene que mandar todo para ti?
Bueno, o sea, cuando antes mejor, mientras más rápido envíen, más rápido estaré enviando a La Habana.
Okay, pero ¿hasta cuándo tú piensas estar en Miami, más o menos?
Estoy en Miami y tengo fecha hasta junio aproximadamente.
So David says as soon as possible. He's planning to be in Miami until June. But as soon as possible, as soon as he gets the stuff, he will pack it up, and
Excellent.
he's working with a couple of charter companies so that they give us a little bit, Gus, you know, I consider myself part of the community. Give them part of a special rate so that things can be sent to Cuba.
There is a question.
One
How
more
many Jewish
yeah.
people still in Cuba? There was a question.
¿Estarán listos para el video en un momento, Miriam?
He wants to know whether he could show the video, but
Yes, and I would say, Miriam, let's answer this couple of questions that we still
Okay.
have in the chat, and then conclude the program today with the video.
okay.
I think
David,
that's really
quieren que tienen dos preguntas y después hacemos el video. So I think it's around 900 Jews in Cuba today. And you know, some young people in Cuba, they're trying to make Aliyah because Cuba allows the Jews to make Aliyah to Israel because they consider Israel the homeland of the Jews.
That's great.
And you had some other questions?
There were questions about like how you ship basically large objects like wheelchairs, because the cost of shipping could be, you know,
Yeah,
Well,
David, el
would
problema
make a
que
donation irrelevant.
la pregunta es cómo se te mandan sillas de ruedas a Miami y de ahí cómo se mandan a Cuba.
Bueno, cómo las mandan a mí, todo está en, o sea, no sé cómo se hace esos envíos de una ciudad a otra aquí en Estados Unidos. Yo sé cómo, o sea, cómo enviar yo a Cuba, lo estoy haciendo a través de agencias que hacen envíos frecuentemente a la isla.
So for wheelchairs, I mean, they'd have to get it to Miami and then he takes over in Miami to send it to Cuba. But it can be expensive to mail, to send a wheelchair over, unless you know somebody who's going to Miami who would take it on the plane, because then there is no cost.
All right, thank you. Thank you
We
so
need
much.
to make a research,
Yeah,
and
we
we
have
have
to
friends
do
over
research,
there.
But you know, they need everything: toothpaste, soap, Band-Aids. I mean, who thinks that Band-Aids, anything at all? You just walk into a drugstore and anything that you can find, they need.
Yeah,
Thank you.
when we landed in Cuba, we brought, if I'm not mistaken, close to 800 pounds of goods when we went there. So we know, we're well aware of this list. It's just the logistic how we bring it.
So we will make sure that David receives what we can collect and provide.
So I have a question
Monetary.
Do they still need stuff for baseball? Well, you know, of course, the kids still play baseball and they play many sports, but they really need, the priority right now is medication and cash donations, so that they can, I mean, the inflation there, we think inflation here is very high. Inflation there is incredible. Sometimes to buy a little piece of chicken can be $5 and $6, and on the salaries people are making, they just can't do it.
Yeah,
Yeah, we've seen it, unfortunately.
David, I think we're ready for your
Okay, David,
presentation.
puedes poner el video.
ירושלים הולך תמיד לרחוב, יש כמו קיבוץ, גלויות, אין תרבויות, וכל אחד ישאר, ערבים בסדר, ערבים בחדר, מוקדים את אלוהים בקדר, אחרי ירושלים מהחנה, יום ליום, תל אביב נתקה יותר, נסבו, קרבו לראש המעבור, שעבד, הנה, שמות על הצירה, שלוש שנים מתחיל לקבל את ההחלטה, סבבה מהצור להגיד בכיוון. ואיזה שוק, אני עומד לחטוף, ועכשיו כשאני בתל אביב סוף סוף תשתלב עם הענף הכותרי וזה טוב. אוי, כמה בשדיים, נסתופי לי העיניים, אחרי שנתיים שזום והמורה, לא מזהה את עצמי במראה. מתבזק משחקים, כל הבעלים של הדיסקוטקים, עכשיו שאני מבין, זה לא נוצא כרעש, כמה תלגי שתלגי, כל היום מתבזק שלום, והסיוט פה, הלכו בשיגעון, ואז נפל האסימון, גל, היה לי בידיים. שלוש שנים להתחיל לקבל את ההחלטה, פורס את החדרים לתוך המזוודה, מהעיר לעצור לכיוון ירושלים. אתה מכיר ככה בנשמע ירושלים. ירושלים, הוא הפוך, טוב זה בטוח, תן לי רוגע, תן לי שקט, לא ישיג איזה פיוק, פעם אחרונה, חלק בגודל, השקעתי באוכל, עשיתי חברים חדשים, אני לא זאת תחזיר לי את השיטה בחיים, מתערבב עם עצמי במקום להרבה מים, נשאור קצת אוויר, הרים צלול כיין, יאללה בטח, יאללה חיים בכפר, העיקר להיות מאושר.
Bueno, creo que muestra, Miriam, creo que ese video recoge que aunque seamos una comunidad pequeña en número, somos una comunidad grande, pero bien grande en una vibrante vida judía.
So
donde todos
David is
podían
saying,
dar-
I'm sorry, even though it's a small community, we are a very large community because we have a lot of Jewish life.
It is beautiful, and we actually, all of us, almost all on this call, actually witnessed it. Only 2 years ago, we were
We
quite impressed.
experienced it. We
We-
experienced it, how vibrant and lively and involved the community is, and how wonderful it is. And it was really memorable and
Oh,
beautiful. We had
and
the
we will be
best.
happy to stay in touch, and we will be happy to
Continue supporting the
any help we can provide.
the best way we can.
So
Temple
let me
Sinai.
tell-
Temple Sinai formed a club called Sinai World Jury Connection Club. We started it this year, and we have very involved members of that group who will help us organize and continue supporting Cuban Jewish community.
So
Thank you.
there was a question of how much every family need per month, like minimum in Cuba.
You mean to survive or?
Yeah, that's what I'm reading from Dana Levin.
David, te preguntan más o menos, ¿cuál es lo mínimo que una familia en Cuba necesita para vivir?
Mira, yo imagínate que en mis 58 años he recibido, o sea, he tenido tantas preguntas y yo no sé en este momento si esta es una de las preguntas más difíciles que yo pudiera responder, porque a veces que no tengo respuestas, porque no hay una fórmula en Cuba de hoy, no hay un referente.
So
No hay un
déjame traducir. So he says in his 58 years, there are some questions that are very difficult to answer, and this is one of them because there isn't a formula to answer this.
No hay un referente porque hay una inflación que no tiene precedente. No hay un precedente porque la inflación va subiendo de una manera exponencial. Un día te acuestas con el dólar que no circula a 70 o a 100 y te levantas en la mañana con un dólar a 120.
So
Es
déjame
imposible
decir,
poder,
the inflation is so rampant in Cuba today. For example, the legal exchange rate of a Cuban dollar to Cuban currency is 24, but nobody pays the legal. So you could go to sleep and a Cuban dollar will give you 70 pesos, and then you wake up in the morning and it's now 110 pesos. Inflation is without stopping. It's just there's just no way to describe it. So it's very rough. I know, I've heard from my friends in Cuba. Living in Cuba today is very, very, very difficult because they're not getting the people they used to get. The past administration cost a lot of it. And because of COVID, people are maybe just beginning to go back. And it's very difficult to live in Cuba today.
Definitely. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you
So
for
we
a
all will be in
wonderful
touch with
lesson.
you.
Thank you for a wonderful lesson, Miriam. You're
Yeah.
fabulous storyteller. It was
Yeah.
really
Thank you.
wonderful to
And-
learn from you and to get to know you a little bit. And thank you, David,
And
for joining
gracias,
us.
David, for
Gracias, David. And thank you to Anne and Andy
Gracias.
for making this connection for
the
us.
shidduch.
Yeah, for making the shidduch. That's right. We will keep in touch. We will stay in touch, and we will do whatever we can to help.
Please,
the community.
please do so. It's another part of us, the Jews of Cuba, that many people don't think of. Anything you want to donate, be it in goods or money, it will go for wonderful use. And people will say, someone in America that I don't know is thinking of me.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cuba always was on the mind of Temple Sinai 2 years ago, and I know that before that was another like 7 or 8 years ago was another trip. So you're always on our radar.
Yes.
Quiero reiterar,
Gracias.
quiero reiterar las gracias por esta oportunidad. Y Vin Diesel dijo o sea, creo que sí, que fue Vin Diesel quien salva una vida, salva a la humanidad. Y yo creo que hoy quien salva a la comunidad judía de Cuba, salva la identidad a nivel mundial. Porque somos personas que sobre todas las cosas luchamos por mantener fuerte nuestra vida, nuestra tradición y nuestra historia de milenios de años.
So David says, he who saves one person saves the world,
The universe.
Yes.
Yeah.
the
Indeed.
universe, and we need to help each other and keep going. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you all of
Stay
you.
well.
Thank
Stay
you.
well. Was
Yeah, and it
wonderful
was
seeing all of
wonderful
you.
to get to know
So
you and
good
wonderful
to
to
see
see
you.
everyone who joined us today.
Adrian, can you do a
Am
full?
Israel, hi. Am Israel, Bekuba, hi.
Yeah,
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you. Stay
Thank
well.
you.
Wonderful seeing all of you.
we are with you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.